The time is now 7 p.m. and I'll call to order the regularly scheduled meeting of the Beloit City Council. We're here at 100 State Street, Beloit, Wisconsin, and today is Monday, July 21st, 2014. Can I have a roll call?
Roll call shows all councilors present.
Thank you. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Item 3 is special orders of the day and announcements. We have none this evening. Item 4 is public hearings, and we have none. So item 5 brings us to citizens' participation. We have reached the point in the meeting for members of the public to speak to the council about issues that are coming before us or may come before us in the future. The council will not act on any requests this evening unless the item you are speaking about is already on our agenda, but we may act on requests at a future meeting, or we may refer a speaker to staff for assistance. We ask that you hold your comments to 3 minutes or less and avoid making any personal attacks. Is there anyone wishing to speak tonight during citizens' participation? Please approach the podium and state your name and address the council. Second call for anyone wishing to speak to the council this evening during citizens' participation. Please approach the podium now. Third and final call for anyone wishing to address the council this evening during citizens' participation. Seeing none, we will close citizens' participation and move to item 6, the consent agenda. All items listed under the consent agenda are considered routine and will be enacted by one motion. There will be no separate discussion of these items unless a council member so requests, in which case the item will be removed from the general order of business and considered at this point on the agenda. Is there any councilor wishing to remove an item from the consent agenda? Seeing none, the consent agenda consists of items 6A through D. Is there a motion to approve?
Motion to approve. Second.
Moved by Lupke, second by Haynes. Is all in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed? Consent agenda is approved 7-0. Item 7 is ordinances, 7A.
A proposed ordinance to amend sections 25.04 sub 1 sub D, 31.30 sub 1, and 15.30, and to create section 31.30 sub 1M of the Code of General Ordinances of the City of Beloit pertaining to forfeitures for juvenile matters in municipal court.
Ms. Krieger.
At the request of the City Council after a workshop on June 30th, I was directed to provide an ordinance for Council's consideration that reduces the forfeitures for juvenile offenders in municipal court. I have done that, and it's attached to the staff report. Essentially what I did was reduce about half the value of the tickets from adult offenses. The specifics, if you look to the exhibit that's attached, I tried to break down so you could have in front of you each offense of each of the enhanced adult penalties and what that breaks down to for juvenile offenders. It is redlined there so you can see what the previous forfeiture was and what the new proposed forfeiture was. On the top of the exhibit, I did receive some questions about what the base fine and what the total with cost means. The base fine is set by ordinance, and then any additional assessments or costs are tagged on to that. Those fees go to the county and to the state. So whatever the base fine, the forfeiture, the council decides to set as its forfeiture, the additional fees and assessments will go to the county or the state depending upon the how high the offense is, or how high the forfeiture is. With that, if you have any questions, I can certainly entertain that, but I meant this just to be a jumping off point for council to consider however you wanted to handle it.
Thank you. I'll open this up for council discussion, and just wanted to note that although this is on the agenda for suspending the rules and having a vote tonight, we certainly have the option of laying this over if there is a desire to do that. Councilor DeForest.
Thank you. I do have some questions and some comments, and I would like to request that we lay this item over so we have more time for input and discussion. There were some people in the community who were trying to access the council packet and had difficulty doing so. So I think given that, we should certainly lay this over. I have one question about that I had left in a voicemail. Are we legally bound by defining an adult as 17 and older?
Yes, you are.
Okay, so we have no choice in that matter?
Correct.
By state statute. And then my comment is that I appreciate the effort to reduce the fines, but the base fine with the court costs still seem high to me. If you're a kid with very little money, whether the fine is $200 or $1,000, I think, for many of the children that we're talking about, $200 feels like $1,000, and I would request that we consider even a lower base fine. I guess partly because I know we have separated truant and habitual truant. Most of the kids that we're seeing in court who are getting issued citations are habitually truant. Is that correct?
Correct. Those tickets are generated by the school district. They file a request for the police department to issue those citations. So majority of those habitual truancy, the majority of the truancy tickets are habitual truancy.
Right. So my concern is the majority of the truancy tickets, the habitual truancy tickets, they're starting already at a base of $100, and then when we add court costs, we're looking at almost $200. So I just feel like we're back with a pretty high cost for a first-time kid coming to court. So I would like to see those amounts even lower. So I guess I would like to go back to my first comment and request, I'd like to make a motion to lay this over and look for a second.
It's been moved to lay over. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Haynes. Is there further discussion on this item before we do that? I see Councilor Lubke.
Thank you. I'd also like to request a holdover, but I'd like to also request that at our next meeting, we invite principals, psychologists, social workers, counselors, truant officers, others who deal with this problem day in and day out to come and give their perspective. We had a absence of their presence at the last meeting, and I think that would shed some light on this whole picture, a greater picture. So I would, again, second or third Ms. DeForest's request, but I would also like to have school people here to either make a presentation or defend current practice. Thank you.
Councilor DeForest.
Thank you. I agree. I would like for us to make a special effort to reach out to school district officials, but I don't want to make light of the school district personnel that were here. We had 3 school district individuals here, Fred Atlas, Robin Stutt, and Mr. Anderson, who all work for the school district in capacities related to this. So I want to make sure we're not saying that no one from the schools were here, because we heard from all 3 of them, and I appreciate their effort to participate, but I would like to see more input from school district officials as well.
Are there any further comments on this item? I would just like to say I also agree with laying it over, and want to just take a look at making sure that we look at those total costs and make sure that they are at a place that gets done what we're trying to accomplish, and I think that can certainly use additional input from the community. Ms. Krieger?
Is there anything specifically you're looking for a substitute amendment? Or because if we lay this over to the next meeting and you make any changes, it'll have to be laid over to the following meeting because the municipal court judge has to approve these. So is there changes that you would like to see from this draft to the one that will be coming back in 2 weeks? And what those changes are, so I can make sure they're in the amendment.
Councilor DeForest.
Thank you. I would like to see our base fine offenses be lowered to 50, not just for habitually truant, but for many of the other juvenile offenses that have been outlined in our ordinance draft. Instead of starting at 100, I'd like to see them start at 50. I also would like the council to discuss a cap per individual. It's possible that we could have a youth who has, let's say, 2 truancy tickets and then gets a violation for their dog getting loose. And I just worry about racking up the fines. And I mean, if the fines are designed to serve as kind of this stick, I don't know if by keep throwing on more and more fines and tacking on accumulated amount is really working. And so I would like to see us consider also possibly a cap per individual child that they can accumulate somehow. I don't know if that's possible, but I'd like for us to talk about it.
That actually is not possible. If they violate the ordinance, they would be subject to whatever penalties that ordinance would have. Under state law, habitual truancy citations can't accumulate more than $500 in a semester, so there already is a cap on those tickets of $500 per semester.
Per semester or per
That's by-
year?
Per semester, that's by state law.
Wow. Okay,
And I guess,
Sorry.
for me, that's all the more reason why we should start as low as possible, because we could see how, you know, a child who really had a rough year and had trouble kind of getting it together could really accumulate a bunch of fines, and could even, that concerns me. I would like to see us start as low as we can with the first offense.
Vice President Haynes?
Yeah, it sounds like we're at a point where I'm thinking that we're all moving a little prematurely overall here, that there isn't a tremendous amount of consensus. I'm wondering if we're going to be ready to discuss, to actually vote on something in 2 weeks. I think that what Councilor DeForest is bringing up is highly pertinent, but the conversation, I think we need to continue the conversation, and I'm not certain we will be ready in 2 weeks.
Ms. Krieger, I have a question. When we look at that $500 cap per semester, is that $500 in forfeitures plus whatever court costs are associated with that, or $500 total?
$500 base fine.
Okay, so the court cost would be on top of that.
Currently, that's 2 tickets per semester for each child. We don't get too many that reach that limit.
Is there any further discussion or motions at this time before we vote on laying this over to our next meeting?
Just so I'm
Yes.
clear, what is expected of me at this time?
It can, would it be appropriate to take a straw poll of where the council stands on?
I think if you have the ordinance in front of you, the draft ordinance, any changes to that would have to be by motion.
And it would be appropriate to amend that tonight to give you a chance to check with the judge?
Right, if that's the intention, I need to check with the judge on any changes that you make. So if we don't make any changes until 2 weeks from now, it would have to be laid over an additional 2 weeks for the judge to give his concurrence.
Vice President Haynes?
I don't know, I don't feel comfortable amending this at this particular time. I think that sounds like there's a lot of discussion that we need to continue to have. I think it can be done maybe in, not this one, but maybe by the middle of September, we might be ready to do this, but I'm not comfortable that I'm ready to hear, support a motion to make any alterations to this until we've gotten our heads together.
I see a couple of councilors wishing to speak. I'm wondering if it would make sense to look at scheduling an additional council workshop to go through the specific amounts. That would be one option if we didn't want to try to amend tonight. But I do see Councilors DeForest and Lubke wanting to speak. Councilor DeForest.
Thank you. I agree that it would be valuable to have more community input and school district weigh-in before we make this decision. I'm okay with postponing it another 2 weeks if need be, so we can have that feedback. That would, still put us at the beginning of September.
Councilor Lubke.
I'm very strongly, I'm adamant for having some principals here. We had one person last time who dealt directly with truancy. We had others who maybe come across it in their jobs once in a while. Fred Atlas is, for all intents and purposes, the truant officer. He's overwhelmed with his job. He'll go to a school and maybe get 50 referrals, and he's supposed to make home visits and do other things. The principals on a daily basis are dealing with truancy, and it's a major issue, and it takes a great deal of their time. So I think it's in whether or not, why they weren't here is, I don't know last time, but they need to have some input before we make a change that's very, pertinent to their jobs. Thank you.
Ms. Krieger, would another workshop to specifically go through this ordinance and look at the amounts with an attempt at reaching a conclusion that can be brought to the judge, does that seem like a way to proceed that would work for you? And
Doesn't matter to me, whatever the council decides to do, I will do.
The motion on the floor right now is to lay this over to our next meeting at the beginning of August. I would certainly entertain a motion to amend that to have an additional workshop and lay this over until after that workshop. Councilor DeForest.
I guess I'm feeling like I don't feel like we necessarily need to have a council workshop. I'm feeling like we need to get the school district involved in a discussion. And so I'm hoping that we can do that within 2 weeks. And so laying that over to that point where we could receive some feedback and input. So I'm comfortable with the motion as it lays to lay this over and hopefully either before that point or at that point to receive school district feedback and input, and then, we can decide at that time, and then, have the 2 weeks after that for Attorney Krieger to consult with Judge Henderson.
Is there any further discussion before we vote on this motion? All in favor of laying this over until our next meeting, say aye. Aye. All opposed? This is laid over until our next meeting. Item 8 is appointments. We do have appointments this evening. I, the undersigned Mark Spreitzer, duly elected president of the Beloit City Council, subject to confirmation by the Beloit City Council, do hereby appoint the following citizen members to the vacancies and terms indicated below, said appointments being pursuant to nominations made and approved by the Appointment Review Committee at the regular meeting held July 14th, 2014. To the Board of Appeals, Robert E. Wilkes, 1035 Pleasant Street, number 3306, replacing James Wise as a first alternate for a term ending May 31st, 2017. To the Community Development Authority, Manuel Casares, 839 9th Street, replacing Stephanie Jacobs for a term ending December 31st, 2017. To the Municipal Library Board, incumbent Missy Henderson as the School District of Beloit representative for the 2014-15 school year. To the Park Recreation and Conservation Advisory Commission, incumbent Mark Smullen as the school district representative for the 2014-15 school year. Is there a motion to approve these appointments? Moved by Kincaid, second by Lupke. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed? These are approved 7-0. I'd like to announce the following vacancies and encourage any interested residents in applying. We have on the Alcohol Beverage License Control Committee, 1 vacancy for a resident. On the Appointment Review Committee, 1 vacancy for a resident. The Board of Appeals has 1 alternate vacancy for a resident. The Board of Ethics has 1 vacancy for a former city councilor and 2 vacancies for residents. The Board of Review has 2 vacancies for alternates for residents. Community Development Authority has 1 vacancy for a resident. Equal Opportunities Commission, 1 vacancy for a resident. Municipal Golf Committee, 1 vacancy for resident. The Plan Commission has 2 vacancies for residents, and the Traffic Review Committee has 3 vacancies for residents. If you're interested in serving on any of these committees, please consider that. You can find more information as well as applications on the city website or contact City Hall for more information. It's a great opportunity to get involved and serve your community, and there are a lot of opportunities here that touch on different interest areas, and you just might find one that you like. Item 9 is councilor activities and upcoming events. Councilor Lupke.
Just want to remind everybody how fantastic it is on Friday nights in the park, and how every week it gets more crowded. I went down at 6:30. The music doesn't start till 7, and the parking lots were already filled. I think they're having class reunions down there now. They're having the music. They're having just people in the park. It's just a beautiful, fantastic throwback to the past. Everything but lemonade down there, but it's just, and no mosquitoes. So come on down on Friday nights for the next, until like September 5th. That's all I have.
Councilor DeForest.
Thank you. I enjoyed the Parks and Recreation tour and want to extend my appreciation again to our Parks and Leisure Services staff for all that they do to improve the quality of life for Beloiters by having such beautiful parks and facilities and programming for residents to enjoy. I have enjoyed the farmers market, and I also would like to just let everyone know to look out for the street dances coming soon. I'm really looking forward to that. That's one of the funnest events of the summer when the community comes out downtown for the street dance. Lots of fun things happening in the Beloit area for individuals. So I encourage you to get out and enjoy. Thank you.
Councillor Kincaid.
Nothing this week.
Councillor Hendricks.
I too was able to attend the Parks and Rec tour of the West Side parks this time. There were a lot more parks than I knew existed, and I'm born and raised here in Beloit. So that was good to be able to get out and see some of the community parks and the beauty of the nature that we witnessed. There were several counselors there. So it was a good time. It was a good chance to see what was out there. And I was also at one of the Friday nights in the park and got to wobble a little bit with with some of the music there. So there was a flash mob there that we participated in. That was fun. So thank you.
Councillor Kelly.
I'm sorry to say, I have nothing to report.
Vice President Haynes.
Well, I did get a chance to wave at everyone as they were passing in the bus as I came past my house the other day at the Parks and Rec, but unfortunately I was tied up, but that's all I had to report.
Well, I also enjoyed attending the Parks Tour. It's one of my favorite annual events that I've been able to do every year on the council. And I also had a chance to attend the groundbreaking for North Star, and that was a great event with a lot of dignitaries there and an exciting project that will bring jobs to our community, so it was great to be able to be a part of that. Item 10 is the City Manager's presentation, 10A.
The 2013 Audit Report.
Mr. Miller.
Good evening. Before I turn it over to the auditors tonight, I would just like to extend a huge thank you to all the staff that was involved in getting all the information ready and preparing the 13 CAFR report this evening. I'd like to say thank you to City Manager Arft for everything that he did, as well as Don Duval and the entire accounting staff, as well as Lillian Morrow and her treasury staff, and Jessica Tyson in finance. I'd also like to thank the auditors, Carla Gogan and Jody Dobson with Baker Tilly, and their staff for giving a lot of help this year as we were under some unique circumstances with a lot of turnover. So with that, again, I just would like to say thank you to the city staff for all their hard work and efforts this year. And now I can turn it over to Carla Gogan and Jody Dobson with Baker Tilly Virchow Kraus, and they will present the 2013 CAFR report.
Good evening and thank you. I've been before the council in the past. I'm Carla Gogan, a partner with Baker Tilly. It is certainly a pleasure to be here, and was under different circumstances this year with the departure of two key individuals within the finance department. So I also want to echo Director Miller's comments. Certainly everyone here has been a pleasure to work with, and certainly I think it was a learning experience, but we worked through it together, and we are just moments away from issuing the final financial statements. We anticipate issuing on Wednesday. So my understanding is that we issued a revised draft last week, and that was posted so that you do have access to the revised CAFR, or the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, and there will be no changes to that. Other than us dating our opinion, there are no changes to that document. And it really was due to the turnover, which is why we took a few extra weeks just to make sure we had everything that we needed in order to issue the financial statements. But we anticipate next year that we'll be back on track and would be issuing by the end of June. One of my main goals tonight is to answer any questions that you have. So please feel free as we're going throughout. You don't need to wait until the end. If we're talking about a topic that you'd like more information about, please feel free to jump in at that time. My focus tonight is going to be primarily on the governmental funds. primarily the general fund, so those funds that are supported by tax dollars and intergovernmental revenues, your shared revenues and highway aids. And then I'll be turning it over to Jody, and she'll be talking through some of the utility highlights, those funds that are supported more by user charges and so forth. So in terms of the documents that you do have, I am going to be going through the slides in just a moment, and you do have a hard copy of that. All of the information contained in here is directly taken from the financial statements themselves. So if you want more information and you want some additional detail, feel free to focus your attention there. As I've said in prior years, I would highly recommend for you and for those at home to read what's referred to as the management's discussion and analysis, and that's included within the CAFR. It's in the front before all of the schedules. And what it does is it's a prescribed form, so the standards dictate what must be included in that form, but it's a really nice synopsis as to what occurred over the last year. So it's going to, I think, help put some context around the financial statements versus trying to navigate through 200 pages. The other thing within the document, though, that I do want to make reference to is the auditor's report or the opinion, and that's what you're hiring us to do. You're hiring us to give you an opinion on your financial statements, and as we have done in the past, we're issuing a clean opinion, or what's otherwise referred to as an unmodified opinion. So that is not a surprise and is what you should expect tonight. When I talk through financial benchmarks, we usually look at three things, and we're going to focus on two of those things tonight. When you look at the health of a community, and that's all Jody and I do is work with municipal governments, we're looking at three components. One is the condition of a municipality's assets. So it's infrastructure, it's buildings, it's equipment, because that's going to tell you as you're doing your capital budget, you know, what your borrowing needs might be and so forth. And we're really not going to spend time on that piece. But as you're looking at the financial health of a community, we recommend that you certainly consider that piece. The other two pieces that we'll look at are your fund balance or your reserves within the general fund, and we're going to take a look at that and we're going to compare that to what policies you've established within the city. And then the third piece is we're really going to look at the debt position of the city. And then Jody's going to talk through some other benchmarks as it relates to the utilities and some specifics related to some of the revenue bonds. So with that, we're going to start with taking a look at the general fund, which is the primary operating fund of the city. So this fund is where you're going to have your primary costs related to public works, public safety, your administrative costs are going to be running through the general fund. And when I talked about that second piece that we look at, your reserves, that's your fund balance. So if you think about fund balance represents assets of the general fund, which are primarily liquid in nature. This does not include any capital assets. So it's going to be cash, receivables, less any payables related to the general fund, and again, more liquid in nature. This doesn't include long-term debt, for example. And what you're left with is fund balance. And the accounting standards tell you how you need to categorize fund balance. And that's what's listed here. And there's a slide coming up in just a few slides that gives you some specifics about what the fund balance means. But in total, you have total fund balance in the general fund of $10.4 million. So that's the assets of the general fund, less liabilities, and you're left with the $10.4 million. But then we break that down into the three categories, which the first is non-spendable. And this is primarily made up of an advance from the general fund to the golf course. And that advance has existed for quite some time, and we've talked about that advance in the past. It's also made up of inventory. The city's not in the position of liquidating its inventory. It could if it needed to, but you're not in the business of selling inventory. So that, again, is an asset that's not liquid in nature, as well as some receivables that are not liquid in nature. Assigned fund balance, this represents funds that were applied to the 2014 budget or the 2014 expenditures, and that's just over $600,000, very comparable to the prior year. And what you're left with is unassigned fund balance of $8.3 million. And if we move down the page, we compare that to next year, or what is this year, 2014's operating budget for the general fund. So just to take a step back, we are talking about results as of 12/31/13, and we know that you're in your 2014 year, and you're now already talking about your 2015 budget. So just so we're clear in terms of what year we're talking about. But the city does have a policy, and it is outlined in the notes to the financial statements, that In terms of unassigned fund balance compared to the next year's operating budget, you're at 27%. And you have a policy that says that percentage needs to be a minimum of 15% of operating revenues or 3 months of the general fund's operating expenditures, whichever is greater. And the greater of those two amounts is the 3 months of operating expenses, which would be at then 25%. So you are exceeding your minimum percentage. So in terms of benchmarks, one, it's great to have a policy because that allows management to manage to that policy, as well as when you're doing your budget to ensure that you're following what policies you've set. But you are in compliance with the policy that you've set. So that's certainly good news. As we continue down the page, we'll look at how you got there for the year. So this looks at your 2013 activity. So this is going to be all your revenues, less your expenses, equals you had a reduction in fund balance. So if you go back up to the top where I showed you total fund balance in the general fund, it did go from 11.3 million to the 10.4 million. So it did go down by about 952,000. One thing to keep in mind, though, and we're going to look at a slide in a moment, you had budgeted to reduce fund balance by about $600,000. So fund balance was reduced by about $950,000. You had budgeted a $600,000 reduction. And we're going to talk in a moment what contributed to that additional reduction. We are going to come back to the general fund in just a moment. I'm just going to touch on a couple highlights, then we're going to dive into some of these in a bit more detail. As we talked about, that second benchmark looks at your general obligation debt compared to what you're authorized to borrow. So your GO debt is what, as you're borrowing for projects, capital projects within the city. General obligation debt is secured by the taxing authority of the city, whereas Jody's going to talk about revenue bonds, which are secured by the rates of the utilities. You had GO debt of almost 55 million at the end of the year, and this is made up primarily of cities' responsibilities of repaying that GO debt. The utilities do have a piece of this, about $4.8 million. And also keeping in mind that some of the GO debt is also for TIF projects, and so the intention is that the TIF increment that's generated in the TIF districts, that's going to repay this general obligation debt. We compare that to the capacity of the city, and that's limited to 5% of the city's equalized value. So your GO debt capacity is 68 million, and you're going to see it did go down quite significantly from 2012. And again, that's a direct reflection on equalized values going down. And we're going to look at a graph in a moment, which is going to show you a 5-year historical picture of what has happened with the GO debt capacity. But that does impact then, how much capacity that the city has in which it can borrow. So you're at close to 80%. And again, we're going to look at a graph in a moment that I think has a pretty telling picture. Actually, in terms of GO debt, you're really at your lowest point in GO debt outstanding in the last 5 years. But unfortunately, because of the equalized value coming down every year over the last 5 years, it's shrunk your capacity. Internal service funds, we bring this up because internal service funds are meant to balance to zero. You're going to have some years, and this is primarily made up of insurance-related items. Some years you're going to maybe have claims experience which isn't so positive, and so you may run some deficits, and then the next year you may run some surpluses, which over time your goal is really to net to zero here. And why we include this is because if you're incurring significant deficits over time, and you can see from 12 you had a deficit and now you're in a positive position, which is a better place to be, of course. It can have an impact on your general fund. It can have an impact on, again, what you're going to need to budget in order to recover from that deficit. So that's why I bring that up. So back to fund balance. This takes a 5-year look at fund balance. If you look at 2013, the totals, again, you're at 10.4 million in fund balance, and that was the same level back in 2009. You can see it did spike up last year, again, but it was anticipated that you were going to be using some of the funds that you had at the end of 12 in order to balance the 2013 budget. This gives you, and we've talked about this, the definitions of the different pieces of fund balance. So just for your reference point, what the different pieces of this mean. Again, non-spendable are those things that are not liquid in nature. Assigned, those are things that as a council you can decide to use fund balance, so that becomes an assignment. And unassigned is what is left over, and that's the piece that you're looking at compared to your operating budget for that benchmark that we talked about. So we mentioned before how you got there, and this just gives you a more detailed look at the results for the year. You can see that total revenues were under the final budget by about $500,000. The biggest piece of this, and you're going to see it, it's broken out into a separate line this year, is the unrealized loss on investments of about $500,000. And I think it's really important to note that my clients who have the city is limited to what you can invest in by state statute. And so my clients who have an investment portfolio, so things other than, a checking and savings account at the bank, experienced losses on their investments this last year. But the intention is that you're going to hold your investments to maturity. And if you hold your investments to maturity, this loss will reverse itself. Yes?
My first thought was, interest rates are so low now, is that the main cause of this?
Right, and with municipal bonds this last year, and with interest rates, we were seeing about a 4% decline in terms of investment in values, in terms of what you're allowed to invest in. And, and so I don't want you to walk away thinking that it was a bad decision to invest in what you're investing in, because ultimately the only way you're going to earn any kind of return is to have an investment portfolio. But for this time of year, given the low interest rates in the bond market and so forth, this was a very common occurrence for our clients. But again, this will reverse itself, and it is the city's intention to hold its securities to maturity.
And are these mostly bond securities, or?
And Eric could probably speak, I
Okay.
think, bonds.
As opposed to equities?
Oh, yes,
Yes.
we
Yeah,
don't
okay.
have any equity.
It's too much of a
position.
gamble,
No,
okay.
we're not allowed to invest in any equity positions.
Bonds are set, but
Yep.
very low rate now.
Bonds, CDs, municipal.
Okay. Money
debt.
market?
Yep,
Yeah,
money
which
market,
are
that kind of thing.
Rock bottom. Thank you.
Yes, but good point that Director Miller made, and that is the city is not allowed in the investments that it is allowed to, it's not allowed to invest in equities, which you could have volatile, and in those cases, you could experience losses that would not reverse themselves.
Thank you.
So that is the most significant driver in terms of the overall results for the year in terms of revenues. And if you look at expenditures, they're right on at $96,000. I mean, that's less than 1%. And if you look at overall, even with the loss on investment income, you look at your results very close to your final budget, which again just shows good budgeting practices and able to keep costs within what you had budgeted. So as you can see, overall, in terms of from what you had budgeted to what the actual results were, it was a negative results of $362,000. This is going to go through, again, more detail in terms of actual revenues, that unrealized loss we talked about. The water utility does make a payment in lieu of tax every year, and this tax payment is based on the value of the water assets, and that was more than what was budgeted due to increase in value of the assets. Again, in the expenditure side, I mean, you were less than 1% variance compared to your budget, so very close results. This just takes a look at revenues a different way, and we do include the debt service fund in this graphic because the debt service fund, the costs associated with debt service are going to be paid for typically through TIF increment and tax levy. And so we take a look at the various revenue sources. As you can see, intergovernmental revenues with shared revenues being about 16 million of that 19 million. But again, very consistent year after year. This just shows it to you in a bit different format. This just compares 2013 to 2012. And then moving on to expenditures. This takes a look at the expenditures in the general and debt service fund. Again, pretty flat across across the board. I think another metric, though, we like to look at is, not only do you look at how much GO debt you have outstanding compared to the limit, but also taking a look at how much you spend on an annual basis on debt service. And financial advisors would recommend keeping that below 20%. And you can see from this graphic that debt service, so this is principal and interest, is less than 20% in terms of your total spend. We do exclude from here refundings, and that's certainly been, a frequent occurrence over the last number of years with the low interest rates. So most of my clients have been taking advantage of that and refunding, but we don't include that principal in here because that principal is being replaced with just simply new debt. So just one more, and then I'll be turning it over to Jody. And this is, as I mentioned earlier, the GO debt capacity. If you look at the top line of the numbers below the debt limit, you can see that back in 2009, the debt limit of the city was $87 million. And again, that was based on 5% of equalized value. You can see that that's trended down about $18 million or 21% over the last 5 years. But yet, if you look at GO debt outstanding, as I mentioned, you're just under $55 million. And if you look at the last 5 years, you're at the lowest point in terms of GO debt outstanding. But again, that percent available is at that 20%. So I know that you're in frequent conversations with your municipal advisors, and we're not your advisors, but again, this is just an important benchmark to be looking at as you're looking at your borrowing needs. Before I turn it over to Jody, are there any questions regarding the general fund results?
Councilor DeForest.
I do have questions. I'm not sure what point to interject, 'cause I know, Ms. Dobson, you're going to be talking about the water and sewer utility. At what point, are you going to talk with us some more about the material weakness that controls, or should I ask those questions now, or are you planning on doing a presentation about that?
Why don't we finish with the water
Okay.
and the utilities, and I'll come back up and we'll walk through that and walk
Okay,
through
great.
any questions that you might have.
Thank
Any questions, though, on the financial results at this point? Okay.
All right, well, thank you very much. I said I'm Jody Dobson, and I focus on working with the enterprise funds or the utilities. So just have a couple slides here to walk through. I want to start with the water utility, and the first number we have on the page is the volume of water sold over the last 5 years. I just like to start with that as it gives me kind of an indication of what's going on in the utility. And as we see here, there's been the last couple years, I'll say, our general trend has been a decrease in usage. Now, 2012, we saw an uptick because of the very dry, hot weather. And this was consistent with all the water utilities that I work with across the state. For the most part, saw an increase in usage or water sales in 2012, but they had been seeing some declines, and 2013 was back on that declining trend. So what that points out to me is we just need to be more cognizant in our operations. There used to be a point in time where every year you could assume expenses might go up a little bit and sales of water were also going to go up. And as people are conserving more and we see less water sales, we just need to watch our finances a little more closely as those move in opposite directions. So then as I look at the next two lines here, we have the operating revenues and expenses for the water utility, and that's what's in our graph here. So we can see the revenues did from 2012 to 13 go down a little bit as those sales went down. And at the same time, our operating expenses went up. When I went back and looked at that, we had across the board some inflationary increases, as well as there was a shift with more maintenance costs and less capital additions or large projects. So as those things shift, to seeing more just maintaining the system and small projects, we'll see more of that being in operating costs. So then at the bottom of the page, we have three of the key benchmarks that we look at for a water utility that's an enterprise fund here in Wisconsin. The first one is the cash reserves on hand. And what we often look at here is how many months of operations does that represent? Very similar to your fund balance or reserves for the general fund. And for a enterprise fund utility, the general benchmark that we look at is a minimum of 3 months worth of cash on hand to allow for some cyclical practices in collections and billing. So having, at the end of 2013, just over 4 months worth of cash on hand is a good position to be in here. The next benchmark we have is the rate of return. The water utilities rates are established by the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin, and the rates are designed to recover the operating costs, the depreciation expense on the capital investment or the plant infrastructure, and then a return on that capital investment. And so the last rate study was done back in 2011, late 2010, I think it was right towards the end of the year. And the authorized rate of return with that was just over 5%. So the last 2 years of 2011 and 12, the utility earned above that rate of return. But in 2013, we see it dip down to just under 3.5% being earned. And again, that's a number of things. It's the accumulation over time of costs going up, that increased maintenance, and the decrease in sales brings that all a little tighter. So it may be something that management wants to look at with the budgeting process of, is it time to look at those water rates and see are they still in line with the long-term needs of the utility? And then the last number here we look at for the water utility is the debt coverage. As Carla mentioned, the utility has what we call revenue bonds outstanding. So that debt is pledged to be financed with the earnings of the water utility from its rates. And as one of the covenants as part of that bond resolution, there's what we call a 1.25 debt coverage that's required, saying that the rates need to be sufficient to cover the operating costs plus 1.25 times the debt service. That gives a comfort factor to the bondholders, that there's enough coming in if there was something unusual, the debt service would still be able to be paid. And so we can see your actual was at 1.45, which is good to be above that. One item I do like to point out is that when this requirement is calculated, the payment in lieu of tax that the water utility makes to the city does not go into that requirement, the way the bond resolutions are written. So that's part of what that additional, when you're earning above the requirement, some of that is ability to pay the pilot payment. All right, so then if we move on, we'll look at very similar information for the sewer utility. Starting out with the volumes billed, they generally follow water sales. For a large number of your customers, these are going to mirror each other. So again, we see that the sales of the revenues, which here happens is the blue line, is down a little bit from 2012, but over the last 5 years has been relatively in the same area. At the same time, the operating expenses for the sewer utility have been increasing. And so we can see for a number of years now that they've been slightly higher than the revenues, and that gap is growing. Now, a large amount of that gap is depreciation expense, which is a non-cash expense that the sewer utility records. So it's recovering, or it's representing the use of its capital assets that were previously financed. But what that also tells us that we probably have some aging infrastructure out there that is going to need to be replaced or repaired. So that's something to think about as well. Then down at the bottom, we have two similar benchmarks as far as cash reserves on hand. The end of 2013, a little over 9.5 months, so a very strong position to be in. And also the debt coverage is at 3.4 rather than the required 1.1. So the sewer utility, these metrics show a very strong position, but with that aging infrastructure, we see the debt's been paid down, a large amount of it. Really need to look at what projects may be out there needing to come and how would that impact the finances, how quickly could that draw down those reserves. One other item to point out with the sewer utility is that the DNR does require every other year that sewer rates be looked at. So that's something that management needs to monitor. And I think it's been a couple years since the last 5-year forecast was done, back in 2009. So that may be a time to look at that as well. The stormwater utility, a little different here because we don't have a volume that we're billing on. We look at the equivalent residential units that are billed, and very minimal increases or decreases over time as things are adjusted here, very stable. And when I look at the operating revenues here, also very stable. The expenses have gone up and down a little bit. Looks like 2011 was kind of a low year, but the last 2 years have been right in the same line. So overall, very consistent operations for this fund. And then when we look at the cash reserves and the debt coverage, again, both in a very good position, having 7 months worth of cash reserves and exceeding the debt coverage requirement. So meeting those bond requirements there. All right. And the last fund that I want to look at is the transit system. This one we look at a little differently because of the way the transit system is funded. That the funding comes from both fares or ridership revenue, local funding, and state and federal aid. In addition, the capital additions, when you have to go out and buy a bus or build a transit facility, those are financed through a combination of typically of federal capital grants and then local financing on the front end. So we don't expect to be recovering that depreciation expense over time in the same way as we do in the other utilities. So looking at the revenues here, and we've got them across the top and then down kind of in the bar graphs, we can see overall a pretty stable position as far as the makeup of the revenues, not a lot of jumping around between the categories year over year. There were new fares put in place at the beginning of 2012, which is why we see the passenger fare revenue and other operating revenues such as advertising revenues, et cetera, increasing a little bit for the last couple years. And then when I look at the state and federal subsidies together, those made up 57% of the operating expenses were recovered through those two subsidies. And actually the operating grants were maximized or used to their full potential for 2013. When I look at the operating expenses overall, it's only a 2% increase from 2012 to 2013. So that's, I think, a fairly reasonable percentage. And when I look at the mix of expenses, has remained relatively constant, and the majority of those costs being in personnel expenses is very typical for a transit operation, that it's quite labor intensive. Are there any questions on those slides? Otherwise,
Councilor DeForest?
Thank you. Could you explain the misstatements, the audit adjustments in the utilities, what that was about?
a number of those, I guess, are things that we help out the utility with on an annual basis. So it's things such as at year end, going through the different capital additions and determining which ones of the sub-accounts that they should be in. So management will pull all of the information together, and then we'll take a look through it and help recategorize those as part of the audit, then calculate the final depreciation.
Okay. You didn't have any concerns at all, did you? It was just a matter of how it was organized or how it was categorized in each of the funding line item subcategories, or?
It's really getting into the level of detail that the Public Service Commission and the DNR like the records to be maintained at, as far as segregating out what's been invested in, say, water mains versus the hydrants versus the service lateral that goes up to the house, so getting that into more detail.
Okay, great, thank you.
So I would like to just comment on another document that you have, which is referred to as the communication to those charged with governance and management. And this document still is in draft form. I want to just comment on the fact that there are 4 sections to this document, with the first being, as was noted, we break out any material weaknesses, and we'll come back to this in a moment. So the first section details out any material weaknesses. We're required to provide those in writing. The second piece of the document is really, it's a communication piece that we want to make sure that as part of the audit process and as we're planning for next year, that we have your input. So if there are certain things that you're concerned about, we want you have our contact information. Don't ever hesitate to reach out to us directly if there's something that you're concerned about. We want to make sure that there is two-way communication, because we do adjust our audit approach every year, depending on what we determine or what we think may be more risky areas, and that may be driven by what's happening in the economy, current events and so forth. The third piece are really more informational points, things that are maybe happening within the Government Accounting Standards Board, new standards coming into play, other control deficiencies that we're putting in writing. And then the last piece is another required communication, which specifically spells out what we're required to communicate to you. So with that said, I'm going to open it up if you have any questions regarding this particular comment to make sure that I address specific questions.
Councilor DeForest?
So is this my time to talk about specific auditors' comments? I guess and I wasn't able to locate the audit from the previous year or the year before, but it seems like some of these comments are the same that we've seen before. And so I know part of it is just that your standard practice is you have to point out these areas of weakness to us, even if maybe we can't rectify them. But I guess I wanted your professional opinion about if there's any of these that are particularly concerning to you that we should try to address. One of the things that concerned me most in the list of all the material weaknesses related to controls is the absence of a formal risk assessment process. I was surprised to see that. Could you talk about that a little bit, please?
Sure. If I were to break these down kind of into 3 segments, I would break them down into the first, looking at the formal risk assessment. And I do highly recommend that this be something that is addressed. And I did have conversations with former management and with about this, and as you know, there was a change. But this is an area where I do believe that emphasis needs to be placed, and that is looking at, and what I always say to communities is just do something. It doesn't have to be perfect. You know, I think sometimes they're looking to put it into a perfect form or perfect document, but this is really looking at, you know, where's the potential for something to go wrong, and then putting steps in place to ensure that, you know, looking at what's the magnitude of something potentially going wrong and what's the frequency with which something could go wrong, and put some things in place. And we're certainly happy to have some additional dialogue, you know, with you, you know, about this. I think this is highly important, and would recommend that this, you know, that some emphasis be placed on this. You know, the other thing that we've talked about or other clients will do is, you know, even as it relates to current events, you know, things that are happening, fraud at other communities, you know, and that's really one of the main differences between a public entity like yours versus maybe a private company. You know, fraud may occur at a private company, but you may never hear about it unless it's publicly traded. You know, whereas, you know, with, given that you're the stewards of public tax dollars, you know, things like this will come to light.
So can I ask another question? I guess related sorry, I just lost the page again. Getting used to these new laptops. The point raised that was concerned about receivables. I'm looking for it. And the manager's response was that we are are reconciling them quarterly. Do you think that's a satisfactory frequency, or do you think we should be doing that more frequently? Controls over receivables revenue.
Right, and I may defer to Jody on this particular one. At a minimum, it needs to be quarterly, I would say, you know, but to the extent even it could be done every other month. I just think the more often it's done, then if you run into a problem, it's just less difficult to resolve what that particular issue is. You know, our experience had been that it had been less than quarterly, and I think quarterly is a minimum. The other comment I would note, you know, we have had some repeats as it relates to information technology, and one of the things that we say is if it's not documented, we don't consider it done. So if we can't see a sign-off or evidence that something is being done, even though it's being represented to us that it's being done, you know, then we can't sign off on it because we can't see the evidence for it. So again, you know, some of these things may be being done, but we just really need to see the documentation, you know, that these things are being done as stated.
Well, I guess if I could ask related to that, the finding related to accounts payable disbursements. And so your comment was that access to check printing should be restricted from the person processing accounts payable. And the manager's response was that the accounting division director approves cash disbursements and check printing in those instances when normal controls can't be followed. So is that something that's not being documented, that check off is happening? Because that would be concerning to me that we're not documenting, because that's where we've run into problems as a city before when people got slack in kind of making sure that they were checking over. You know, and no pointing no fingers here. I just want to make sure that as an organization we are documenting that we're approving and documenting the approval of those disbursements.
This is an area where, again, given the limited number of individuals who are working within this area, there is a segregation of duties item that we've noted. And so what we would like to see is more documentation or evidence of kind of a mitigating control in this situation. And again, this is something Eric and I can can have some additional conversations around as to what could be put in place in this situation.
Because I understand the difficulties with the segregation of duties. I mean, we have a very limited staff, so I get that. But I guess I would feel more comfortable knowing that we're documenting the approval. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Eric needs to answer that question.
And this really is
That's
something
been
that
enhanced dramatically.
Don Duvall, the accounting director at this point, is, and I have already had conversations
Great.
in regards to this. And as Carla pointed out, this really is a segregation of duties issues when we're talking about an accounting staff of 2 or 3
Right.
individuals, and you just so happen to might have a couple of individuals on vacation or maybe sick or something at the same time. And it really, this is something that we certainly can address and have already had conversation on, and we'll address it in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Appreciate it.
Are there any additional questions?
Okay. Thank you so much. We certainly appreciate the opportunity to work with you. And again, don't hesitate to reach out if questions do arise.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Item 11 is reports from boards and city officers. 11A.
A resolution approving school resource officer program agreement between the City of Beloit and the School District of Beloit.
Chief Jacobs.
Good evening. You have in front of you a resolution that we're requesting that you approve for the school resource officer contract. This is an extension of many years of intergovernmental cooperation between us and the school district of Beloit. Over 25 years we've had a school resource officer program, and this is just another four-year term this time that we're asking you to approve. The large change in this over just recent history is the additional one school resource officer, so that we can have one on each side of town for the middle schools, and there'll be one school resource officer at the high school. Previously, we split the duties of each side of town with one SRO, so this is an improvement. And the same agreement as far as funds goes, where approximately 180 days of the school contact days is split between the city and the school district at 75%.
Councilor Lubke.
I'd like to make a motion to approve this, and I make that based on the fact that for the last 20-some years, I've worked very closely in my other job, my previous job, with these liaison officers, and it's a tremendous advantage having these men and women in our schools showing our young people the positive aspects of law enforcement and how they can help and work with our young people. So it's a great program, works well in our schools. I wholeheartedly endorse it, and I make the motion for approval.
Moved by Lubke, second by Kelly. Councilor DeForest.
Thank you. I wholeheartedly agree. I have some questions about the agreement, though. So there's indication here, and you had noted previously that we're removing the supervisory costs that we were charging to the school district. So I just want to be clear, who will be supervising these school resource officers? Will we still be the ones supervising them?
Well, it's mutually,
Okay.
they're supervised. The day-to-day activities at the school are governed by the principal of the building that they're in at that time. However, all of the reports and investigations are taken care of by the patrol supervisor.
Okay, so in a sense, we're absorbing that cost as a means to help meet the school district partway, because they now need 3 officers instead of the previous 2 officers, is that correct?
Yes,
Okay.
that was a request by the school district, and it
Okay.
seemed reasonable to add that back.
And then if I could ask about the summertime, so these 3 school resource officers will become beat officers, is that correct, during the summertime?
There's a potential for that. However, we encourage them to use their accumulated leave time during the summer if they can. They're not burdened by some of the requirements we have for vacation picks by the patrol officers who work a 5-2, 5-3 schedule. So we would rather have them take take their time off during the summer, which works out very well. They take it during the summer and also during the non-contact school days, because we find if they take it during the school year, too much stuff happens. Our officers on the street and the cars end up at the schools a number of times dealing with issues that the SROs are better trained and they're better informed about what's going on in school to handle those types of issues.
I guess I'm still curious though, because certainly they don't have a summer's worth of vacation available to them, I would hope. So when they're not using their vacation time during non-student contact days, are we then using them to fill in?
Yes.
For beat officers?
We put them in a squad car and.
Okay, good. They're not becoming detectives or any other, because I would prefer to see them as beat officers.
Yes.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Is there any other questions or further discussion on this item? All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed? This is approved 7-0. Item 12 is adjournment. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Hendricks and second by Kelly. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? We're adjourned at 8:04 p.m.